The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week we're going to discuss the 1916 Athletics, easily one of the more forgettable teams that Connie Macks managed in his half-century in Philadelphia. Those A's won just 36 games and dropped 117, finishing 54 and a half games behind the pennant-winning Boston Red Sox and 40 games behind the next worst team in the American League, the Washington Senators. As a result, the 1916 A's are regarded by some historians as the worst team in the history of baseball. To help us understand the so-called Philadelphia Pathetics, our guest tonight is Andy Saunders, who co-authored the book A's Bad as It Gets, Connie Macks Pathetic Athletics of 1916, published by McFarland. John Robertson is the other author of the book, but unfortunately he could not be with us tonight. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Thank you very much for having me.
Andy, those Philadelphia baseball fans who are familiar with Connie Macks know that he only managed two kinds of teams, unbeatable and lousy. Of course, we celebrate the unbeatable ones, specifically the two championship dynasties he managed. The first came during the dead ball era, when he won 3 world championships and 4 American League pennants between 1910 and 1914. And the second came during the lively ball era, when the Mack men won 2 World Series titles and 3 pennants. If you add the other 2 AL pennants the A's won under Mack in 1902 and 05, Mack won a total of 9 pennants and 5 World Championships. Here in Philadelphia, the big joke is that the A's are still the most successful professional sports team in Philadelphia, and they haven't played a game here since 1954. Anyway, any of those championship dynasty teams are easily deserving of a book. So why did you and John decide to write about the 1916 A's, Connie Macks' worst team?
Well, as you mentioned, the good teams get most of the press. And, there's just something romantic about bad baseball, as it were. And, often, the game isn't always played at its best. And sometimes it's nice to give the other end of the stick a little bit of love as well.
Mm-hmm. And here in Philadelphia, where we really do have a history of haplessness, that's pretty apropos. Major League Baseball has its share of pretty bad teams, including the 1899 Cleveland Spiders, who went 20-134, the 1928 Phillies, who went 43-109, and of course the 1962 New York Mets, who went 40 and dropped 120 games. Compared to those horrific teams, exactly how bad were the 1916 A's?
Well, obviously the 1916 A's had an even worse winning percentage than the 1962 Mets. And usually people consider the 1962 Mets to be the gold standard of 20th century futility, as it were. Obviously the 1899 Spiders, as you mentioned, had a pretty terrible record as well. But one thing we actually did as as part of our book research project, I used Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the computer simulation. I wanted to get to that. You had a fictitious awful teams league, and I noticed that the 1928 Phillies ended up, being the best of those teams, and the 35 Braves ended up being the worst.
Yeah,
and the A's,
I thought...
the 16 A's came in third.
Right, and we've touched on a little bit of why that might be in our, in the right up to after the simulation had finished, because Connie Mack, had so many of his better players get injured so early in the season. Especially, we had Wally Shang injure himself on opening day. And when we did the simulation, Wally Shang, put up pretty darn good numbers. So you can only imagine, how many wins that might have been worth to the team had he been completely healthy all season in real life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. You have a very interesting chapter in here that's titled Heroes, Pleasant Surprises, Villains, and Busts. And you identify some of the heroes as, and actually these were guys who were around during the first championship dynasty: Amos Strunk, Bullet Joe Bush, Stuffy McGinnis, and Wally Shang, who had been the catcher, but after that injury that you alluded to, he ended up playing in the outfield because he couldn't, I guess, squat behind the plate.
Yeah.
And there was even a Hall of Famer on that team, Napoleon Lajoie. So, they weren't all bad players. Some of them might have had bad years, but even some were as you and John described in the book, heroic. So, is there anybody of note who was a villain or just so terrible, to account for this stuff?
Well, I mean, I would say in terms of outright villains, I would say Rube Oldring was probably the biggest villain. I mean, he quit on the team halfway through the season, and lo and behold, ended up on the pennant-chasing Yankees 3 weeks later after his quote-unquote retirement. So clearly he was so upset at having to play for such a terrible team that he wanted no part of it and just decided, I don't want to play baseball anymore.
Mm-hmm. What about some of the other colorful personalities on that team?
Well, certainly there are. I mean, when you have somebody who goes 1-20 as a one-loss record, like Jack Neighbors did, and I mean, Shag Thompson was was at the beginning of the season was kind of billed as the next great A's prospect. He went 0 for 17 and got released. So it's very difficult to there were so many characters on that team. As most bad teams do, they always have these characters. And also, I mean, Connie Macks spent so much of that summer trying to find the next great player in the college ranks, and was shuffling so many players in and out, and even some of the regulars had very little idea of who was coming through and coming up on the team and who they were even playing with.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned Connie Mack and his recruitment of the college ranks. That's one of many ways that he really anticipated many of the economic trends of the modern game. Another way he was a pioneer was that when he realized that he could make more money at the gate with a second-place team that was vying for a pennant rather than a championship team that won the league by 10 or more games, Mack traded or sold some of his star players to achieve that kind of competitive balance in the league. But isn't it bad baseball to build such a lousy team? I mean, I'm sure this wasn't purposeful, but, could he have done anything about this Titanic as it was going down?
Well, I mean, from a business perspective, and I mean, we even see this in the present day with some of the franchises, that in order to, if you want to increase profits, from a business perspective, it's easier to cut expenses than it is to raise revenues. So if you keep cutting expenses, that will certainly have an impact on the quite an impact on the bottom line, even more so than increasing revenue by $1, because with the increased revenue, you have those marginal expenses from time to time that come up from a business perspective that eat into those revenues.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea behind cutting expenses, and I mean, for so much of that 1916 season, Connie Mack didn't even cut the grass at Shive Park. It took until an opposing player hit a baseball in the infield grass and picked it up in the 7th inning to kind of mock the Athletics, as it were, or even shame them into cutting the grass.
That is amazing. Mac has this reputation of being miserly, which he really took exception to, by the way. And there is a controversy which I came down on one side of in a book I wrote about Chief Bender, titled Money Pitcher, The Tragedy of Indian Assimilation. And I argue that the circumstantial evidence says that Chief Bender in the 1914 A's threw the World Series. You're playing against the so-called miracle Braves of Boston, who I think were in last place for the first third of the season and come out of nowhere, but they didn't have the pitching or the hitting that the A's had. And Bender was, unlike in his previous World Series, completely unreliable. And there is a school of thought that Max started trading or selling players because he was fed up and bought into some of these allegations that his ace threw the World Series in 1914. And he held a fire sale as retribution. Do you embrace that theory?
I would almost say that it's about 80% no, they didn't, 20% they did. Because, I mean, obviously 1919 was thrown. Most people think that 1918 was thrown. There were, most people think 1906 was probably thrown. So, with the era that you're dealing with, obviously you're going to think that it's quite possible that it wasn't on the level. And so there's certainly that's certainly something that is at least worthy of debate. Now, I mean, Bender, he was given a scouting assignment when the A's had clinched the 1914 pennant. He had been told, go look at the Braves, take a look at them, and he went fishing. So, it could, you could make just as much of a case for they just, took the Braves too lightly. I mean, Wally Shang had admitted a number of years later that, the team had lived it up too much and not as much thrown it like, taken a dive from gamblers. Because it seems to me like they didn't have the sort of air about them that, maybe a Hal Chase would.
Mm-hmm.
Because, obviously Hal Chase was very, excellent player, but most people today kind of think he was on the take. Like they didn't, at least to me, they didn't seem like they had quite the same air about them as, a Hal Chase. Mm-hmm. And one other thing I thought, we've thought about, Rube Oldring, again, second time he's come up tonight with me. I mean, he had some marital issues around that World Series. I believe he got sued for abandoning a common law spouse about that time. And, having that over your head certainly isn't going to help your baseball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's another school of thought, and this comes out of some of the rather suggestive remarks Mac made to the press after he started selling off these players. One in which he says, if they're going to make their money, I'm going to make some too. And many people interpreted that as Mac, I guess, saw Oldring kind of jump, and with the new Renegade Federal League in existence, he anticipated that many of his other players would jump for a higher salary. So he was going to sell and sell as fast as he could for that reason. And that is another school of thought that has been brought up. But I do agree with you. I mean, I look at the players in that first championship dynasty, many of whom carried over to 1916, and they didn't seem the kind of connivers and cheats like Hal Chase or Chick Gandil of the White Sox would be. But yeah, I just threw it out there, and it got some rather controversial responses. I want to go to the appendices of your book, because you provide a wonderful list of game results for the 1916 season, and according to those results, the A's really didn't get blown out very much. 51 of their 117 losses came by just 1 or 2 runs. That's about 45% of the games they played. So they were pretty close. And the only real blowout came on May 9th when the Detroit Tigers beat them by 14 runs, 16-2. Now, on the other side of the slate, for me reading the book, the most memorable game had to be Joe Bush's August 26th no-hitter at Shibe Park against Cleveland, because it was completely unexpected. I mean, Bush went 15-24 that year. Those 24 losses led the American League, but that seemed to come out of nowhere. And what was even more fascinating about that no-hitter is that you had mentioned that Bush had pitched the day before in the second game of the doubleheader, and he was taken out of the game with a 5-0 deficit. And he went up to Mack after the game, and he begged to start the next day's game. I mean, you never see that today. Tell me a little bit more about Bullet Joe Bush and his season that year.
Well, I would certainly say that that specific season was almost a bright light, as it were, among the entire A's, as it were, because for example, the no hitter, and he still seemed to have that competitive drive the whole season. He went 15 and 24, I think, if you mentioned that. And certainly the most reliable pitcher. If there were an all-star game, I would say that he probably would have ended up representing the A's at the all-star game had one existed back in 1916. Because, every team's got to have their representatives, so.
Andy, for you, what were some of the most memorable games when you were writing this book with John?
Well, first of all, Bullet Joe Bush's no-hitter.
Right.
Another one that really strikes me along the lines of you never quite know when what you're going to see when you show up to a baseball game. When on September 8th, that game, when Wally Shang became the first player in Major League history to hit a home run from both sides of the plate in the same game, like as a left-handed and a right-handed batter, that kind of thing, even from a team that was generally so terrible as the A's, those record-breaking things can still happen from any baseball game you ever go to. What was the biggest shame about that Wally Shang game, though, is because hardly anyone actually went to the park and saw it, because it was raining so badly, and everyone thought the game was going to get canceled, but it didn't. And then, so they played the game, and then Wally Shang goes and hits home runs from both sides of the plate.
Wow. We had, in the 1950s, we, as Philadelphia fans, actually went over to the other side, so to speak. I mean, the A's had always seemed to have been the favorites among Philadelphia baseball fans. And in 1950, their fortunes had already gone downhill. And the Phillies fielded a group of young kids. The average age on the team, I think, was 22 or 23. They were called the Whiz Kids, and they had won the National League pennant in 1950. And many historians, of course, say that one of the reasons the A's left is because the Phillies' fortunes were on the rise. Well, it seems that kind of pattern was happening in 1916 too, because in 1916 most of the Philadelphians went to watch the second place Phillies, who drew over 500,000 fans. Now that kind of gate was what the A's were pulling in during the years of their championship dynasty. But in 1916, they only drew just over 184,000 fans. I guess the only consolation there was that the A's drew 7,000 more fans to Shibe Park than the Washington Senators did to their home ballpark that season, and Washington finished in 7th, one place above the cellar-dwelling A's. Andy, why would anyone come out to watch such a bad team?
You know, that always fascinates and intrigues me. I would say that, often people might be coming to see whatever team is coming into town, whether that, be the Red Sox or pretty much any of the other teams in the American League. I would say that, most of those other teams did have some sort of drawing card, as it were. And I mean, even with the A's, you still had Nat Lajoie with his, being in his last season and, kind of on that victory lap, as it were, and, having, even the team honoring him the same day that, Bush threw his no-hitter.
Mm-hmm. Did you get, from your research, a feel for the Philadelphia fans and how they responded to that season after being spoiled for, 5-6 years with all that winning? I mean, Philadelphia fans in general have a very poor reputation nationally. We're known as the Boo Birds and unreasonable in our expectations. And, of course, baseball back at that period of time when if fans were disappointed, they would do everything from throw seat cushions to eggs to rotten fruit at the players. Did you get a kind of feel for how the fans responded to this pathetic team?
It's really hard to, at least from my research, it was kind of hard to get a sense of that, just because the beat writer from the Philadelphia Evening Telegram, William Weert, or I think his name was pronounced, or Weert or Wart, he wrote for the Sporting News as well, and he seemed to be of the kind of cheerful, unabashed homer, as it were. Right. Not that that's a bad thing, but it was kind of interesting to, always see his optimism in his writing, even though the team was 36 and 117.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you certainly don't have those kind of writers today. And that's
I think they'd be run out of town if they were so optimistic towards the team that was 36 and 117.
Oh, absolutely. In that period of time, the beat writers traveled with the team. So clearly, there were friendships among the writers and the players. You and John mentioned that Mack was not the majority owner of the A's in 1916. So how was he able to get away with fielding such a pathetic team? Did Benjamin care?
It seems to me like if he hadn't been part owner, he certainly wouldn't have had a job at the end of the season.
Right.
I think that, the fact he was part owner gave him that leeway to, field such a terrible club and get away with it, as it were. And, it seemed like, it wasn't, losing terrible amounts of money if it was losing money at all. So from that perspective, because, as I've mentioned, they were definitely trying to keep their expenses down, as I mentioned with the whole let's not mow the lawn and let's try to get our players as cheaply as possible. So from that perspective, it seemed like, even though they weren't successful on the field, they may have been at least reasonably successful in the front office, as it were, with the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've already spoken a little bit about Mack as a pioneer of baseball economics and how he'd actually be a good fit in terms of fire sales with Jeff Loria, the former owner of the Marlins, who won a World Series and then had a fire sale too. But on the other end of things, it sounds like Mack would have been a good fit for teams like the Chicago Cubs and the Houston Astros, and maybe, hopefully, for our current Phillies, because those are teams that lived in the cellar for 4 more seasons before capturing a World Series. What do you think?
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. Connie Mack would have been absolutely at home managing any of those teams, being GM for any of those teams you mentioned. Before the 1915 season, after his, the fire sale in the winter of 1914, as you've mentioned, he flat out said, it's like starting all over again for me, and I love baseball, and I love to build up teams. I've done it once, and I'll do it again. And that would be an absolutely perfect mindset for somebody trying to be the GM of a Cubs a few years ago, or, an Astros even as early as 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Andy, it's a wonderful book. I really learned a lot from it. And listeners, the book again is titled A's As Bad as It Gets. Subtitle Connie Macks Pathetic Athletics of 1916 by John G. Robertson and Andy Saunders. You could purchase the book online at McFarland, that is www.mcfarlandpub.com. Andy, thank you for being with us tonight and for writing such an insightful and humbling book on the old Philadelphia A's.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast, Bill.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.